I'm going to tell you about the most frightening experience I ever had. I'm a realtor in Willow Springs, Missouri. That's part of the Ozark Mountains and very near Mark Twain National Forest. I don't know if that has any bearing on what I saw, mostly because I'm not even sure what it was. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Here's what happened, just last June. My office got a phone call from a woman whose grandmother had recently passed on. She had inherited her grandmother's house, which was barely within the town limits of Willow Springs. Even though I'd been living here for 28 years, I'd never been aware of the place. And this is a very small town, with only a couple thousand residents. It was that remote, set at the end of a dirt road that wound through the mountains. The client was living in California, and she told me she wanted to sell the house, but she wouldn't be able to come to Missouri. She said she hadn't been back here in many years and had no idea what condition the house was in. She did say it was a very old house, built over 100 years ago, and might need some repairs before it was marketable. Basically, my first step would be to evaluate the property and let her know what I found. The lawyer's office dropped off a key, and I drove out to the house, almost getting lost along the way. It was set way back in the woods, and the driveway was unmarked, not even a mailbox. After passing it once, I backtracked and took a guess, turning down the driveway. It was only when I saw the house number on the front door that I knew I'd found the place. It was in more of a state of disrepair than I'd expected. The client had told me her grandmother had lived out the last of her days here, but it looked like it had been abandoned for years. The roof was badly in need of repair, starting to cave in on one section. The paint was peeling and the steps were broken. There was a set of bulkhead doors on the side of the house, secured with a rusted chain and padlock. I made a mental note to ask my client for the key. I carefully picked my way through the tall weeds to the steps, watching out for snakes. We have rattlers here, you know, and this looked like the perfect setting for them. I fit the key into the lock and opened the door, not quite knowing what to expect. I was actually pleasantly surprised. Although it smelled a bit musty inside, the interior didn't look bad at all. You could tell my client's grandmother had cared for her home. There were crocheted doilies on the tables and TV stand, and simple but pretty curtains hung in the windows, probably hand-sewn. The place was clean, no dirty dishes or trash. It was just dusty and needed airing out. I walked around inspecting the condition of the walls and ceiling, trying to spot any issues that needed repair beyond the roof and exterior. It didn't look too bad, and the house, being quite large and set on 3 acres, would no doubt bring a pretty penny on the market. I figured I'd better take a peek in the basement, even though I was unable to open the bulkhead doors to air it out. A lot of these older homes have dirt basements, but I had come prepared, wearing old sneakers. I found the cellar door in the kitchen, painted white with a black cast iron sliding latch on it. I slid the bolt, opened the door, and flipped on the light. The light didn't work. I flipped the switch on and on again, but the bulb was obviously burned out. For a minute I thought of skipping the basement until the next time I came, but I wanted to be able to provide the client with an accurate home value. I went back to the kitchen and rummaged through the drawers. Thankfully, I found a flashlight. I shined the beam down the stairs. Yep, just as I'd expected, it was a dirt floor. The stairs looked okay, though. I swung the beam around a bit, checking for broken boards. It was then that I noticed something disconcerting. There were scratch marks on the inside of the door. Claw marks like the kind a dog makes when he wants to get in. I examined them in the light. They ran pretty deep. The door would have to be replaced. Filing that information away, I started down the steps, feeling bad for the old woman's dog, apparently locked in the cellar. I was careful going down, not knowing how long it had been since someone had used the stairs. I had to stop several times when I ran into cobwebs to wipe them off my face. I was getting a little creeped out, but then I was finally at the bottom. The only windows were tiny rectangular squares, set high up. It was pretty damn dark. I tried to focus on looking for foundation issues, but I was starting to feel uneasy. You know how if you have your eyes closed, sometimes you can tell when someone comes into a room, even if you don't hear their footsteps? Something about the way the air shifts. Like the space you're in seems smaller when you share the room with someone else. Maybe that sounds crazy, but as I moved further into the dark basement, shining my beam on the stone walls and dirt floor, I had a terrible certainty that something was down there with me. My heart started to pound, and I started to panic, swinging my flashlight beam around erratically, trying to see what it was. I knew something was there, and then I saw it. It was crouched up on the rafters, a dark shape as big as a man. My flashlight beam caught the yellow reflection of its eyes first, and then I saw the flash of teeth. I said, "Holy shit!" and stumbled back a step, but I was afraid to turn my back on it. It seemed to know that I'd seen it. It shifted position, and suddenly I saw wings. Great, terrible, dark wings unfolding from its body like it was preparing to come after me. I screamed and ran for the stairs. Unfortunately, I stumbled and dropped my light, but I was too afraid to go back for it. Thank God I didn't fall. I just careened on through the dark until I hit the staircase and then scrambled up as fast as I could. I heard a noise behind me, and I was absolutely terrified, knowing the thing was gaining on me. I took those stairs 2 at a time, praying I didn't trip again, and by the grace of God, I made it to the top before it caught me. I barreled through the door and slammed it, bolting the latch and leaning back against it, trying to catch my breath. And that's when I heard it. Scratching, down low on the door, just like a dog that wants to be let in. I ran from the house without even locking it behind me, jumped in my truck and took off. I drove like a madman out of the woods, wanting nothing more than to reach town. Whatever that creature was, I never wanted to see it again. I didn't take on the account. I called the client's lawyer and said when I'd gone out there, the front door was wide open, so I decided not to go in case there were vagrants inside. Then I told him, after seeing how far out of town the property was, I had decided it wasn't a good fit for me. I mailed him back the key. The image of that property still haunts me, and sometimes I wonder, is that why the bulkhead doors were padlocked shut? My family used to own a big acreage in a remote part of eastern Tennessee. There's a big fishing pond and a stream that runs through it. During the summer, I used to leave my fishing lines out at night to catch the big catfish we had. You had to go through some real thick patches of woods to reach the pond. There were a couple of game trails I would use. I would drive to the trail entrances from the house and walk about a half-mile in with my gear. I would just use a headlamp for light. I did that pretty often, and I pulled a lot of catfish out of that pond. This one night that I'm talking about, I got down to the area just before sunset. It had been raining sometime earlier, so the trail was a little muddy. About halfway to the pond, I saw what seemed to be a really big footprint. I wasn't used to seeing any footprints but my own, let alone huge ones like that. I put my boot into one of the imprints, and it was about twice as long and twice as wide as my foot. It seemed to have 4 toes, but the depth of them was what got me. Whatever made them had to be really heavy. There were only 2 of them. Like whatever it was had just briefly crossed the trail and then headed back into the brush. All kinds of things ran through my mind, but there was no logical explanation that I could think of. It made me feel uneasy, though. It was just about 9 and I needed to check the lines, so I went the rest of the way to the pond. While I was pulling up one of the lines, I heard a loud splash. I assumed it was just a fish jumping. I kept on with what I was doing. There was a pretty good haul that night. I was just about done when I started hearing this low, guttural groan, and the sound kept multiplying like there was more than one animal or whatever they were. To me, it sounded like they were having a fight. The noise was coming from across the pond. Then I started hearing a lot of loud splashes, and my imagination started going wild. I'm thinking whatever it was might be in the water swimming toward me. I was used to hearing an animal out there on occasion, but not more than one at a time. That's what was really freaking me out. I couldn't imagine what I was up against. Then I heard a loud crash in the woods just yards away to my left. My adrenaline jumped, and I started to feel panicky. All I had for light was the headlamp, so it was hard to get my visual bearings on what was happening. At this point, whatever was making those sounds was behind the tree cover. I'm standing there trying to figure out what to do, and then the woods just broke out in the wildest, loudest sounds of fighting. You can't imagine it. Snarling and howling and these ungodly yelps and whooping noises. Then I'm suddenly hit with this incredible stench, like the wind shifted or something, and all I could smell was rotten garbage and urine. I just dropped my gear and started running down the trail toward my truck. The smell was getting worse, and I thought I could hear footfalls coming up behind me to the left. But it could have been my paranoia. I felt so exposed. I decided to veer off toward the hunting blind my dad had built. It was closer than my truck, and I wanted to get some height between myself and this situation. The blind was about 6 feet high, and I scrambled up there and immediately felt better. Even if it was just psychological, I felt like I had a better advantage. Unfortunately, I had no gun with me. I had never had anything like that going on while I was just minding my own business and grabbing some fish. Everything seemed to have gotten quiet. I looked out toward the trees. The moon was barely half full and I was straining to see. I stayed completely quiet and just kept watching. Then something big came into view out from the cover of the trees, and then another one stepped out. I just about lost control of my bladder. 2 huge creatures with great big shoulders and chests. My best guess was they were about 7 to 8 feet tall. One was a little shorter than the other. They were covered in thick hair but were walking upright. The faces seemed not to have hair on them. They reminded me of some type of giant ape, but different. Maybe more like a caveman, but so tall. Then the bigger one whipped around and lifted its arms up and started screaming and howling at the other one. The smaller one took a step back into the woods, and I decided to haul ass out of there while they were fighting with each other. I got home and locked every window and door and grabbed a gun and stayed up half the night watching for anything to approach. I was at the house alone. Everyone else was gone for the summer and I was caretaking the place. I called my dad the next day and he didn't know what to think, but he sort of just laughed it off. I was pretty sure he wouldn't be laughing if he'd seen that in person. I spent days dwelling on what could have been going on there. Was it some kind of territorial dispute between those creatures? What in the heck could they be? I was even checking the news to see if anything had escaped from a zoo. But there was nothing. No information at all. I wanted to tell you about a frightening experience I had in June. I was so rattled by this encounter, I've actually put my log cabin up for sale. There's no way I'll ever feel safe there again. I've always loved vacationing in Maine. So much of the state is undeveloped, and I'm proud to call myself a tree hugger. Over the years, I've seen badgers, coyotes, bear, deer, and moose, but I've never been in fear for my life until this past summer. My vacation cabin is located on Aziscohos Lake in Maine, near the Androscoggin River. I go there by myself to relax at least 3 times a year. During the winter, it's difficult, as you need to drive in 9 miles on rough logging roads which are unplowed in the winter. I've skied in over the lake a time or two, but it's pretty exhausting. These days, I tend to just go when I can drive all the way in. I went up there in June and had a pleasant week, bird watching and hiking, listening to the loons cry on the lake. Toward the end of my stay, I decided to hike a trail that led to an overlook of the Androscoggin Valley. It was deemed difficult by the hiking book I have, but I was wanting a new experience. I got a new experience, all right. The trail was a bit tougher than I'd realized, overgrown with brambles and fallen trees blocking the way. The amount of debris overtaking the trail made me think no one had used it for a very long time. I got to the first stream crossing and caught a glimpse of a fawn and a doe, which cheered me and renewed my enthusiasm. I filled my water bottle and continued on, knowing I wouldn't find any more water at the top of the mountain. The last leg of the trail involved steep rock faces, but according to the guidebook, you didn't need climbing equipment. There were enough toeholds and footholds that a relatively athletic person could navigate the boulders. I passed by a few large flat rocks that looked to be a prime place to eat lunch on the way down, and filed them away for future reference. By the time I reached the top, I was sweating, but I felt victorious, up there above the tree line, looking down at Androscoggin Valley. The breeze felt good, cooling me down, but an unpleasant odor was carried on the wind. It smelled like death. I looked around to find the source and spotted a bit of fur visible within the tangle of undergrowth. I walked over to look and was dismayed at what I saw. It was the remains of a deer. Its head was intact, the eyes still wide open in fright. The legs and hooves were still recognizable, but my stomach turned as I viewed the rest. Its entire torso had been ripped apart. All that was left was a hollow rib cage. I felt queasy looking down at it and backed away quickly. It ruined my enjoyment of the overlook, so I decided to get away from the smell and climb back down to the flat rocks. At that point, lunch was the furthest thing from my mind, but I thought it would be nice to sit there and reflect on my trip. Within 10 minutes, I had descended to the rock field and chose a nice flat perch. I sat cross-legged and turned my face up to the sun, trying to savor the last bit of vacation I had. Suddenly, I heard a crashing in the bushes above me. I was startled because it sounded like something very big. I craned my neck to see, scanning the bushes, hoping it wasn't a bear. As soon as I started looking around, the noises stopped. It was eerily silent. No birdsong, and even the wind had calmed down. I tried to relax, trying to get back to my Zen state, but I felt anxious. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I decided to head back. It would take about a half hour, I guessed, as it took an hour to climb up. I stood and scanned the trail above me once more, but nothing moved. I started my descent. Every couple of minutes, I would hear a twig snap or leaves rustle. I would stop and wait, holding my breath, listening, and be greeted by silence. As soon as I began to move again, so would the noises. I finally stopped and called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded pitifully anxious. I waited, but there was no reply. I knew I wasn't imagining it. Something was following me. My heart started beating really fast, and I had the urge to run. I tried to calm myself down, but all I could think was, if it wasn't a person following me, then it was some sort of animal predator. I was so glad to see the cabin about 50 yards ahead of me that I broke into a dead run. Immediately, I heard a snarling sound behind me, and my throat closed with fear. I knew instinctively that the animal that had been stalking me was now rushing to attack. I dropped my pack and raced for the door, getting inside and sliding the bolt. I ran to the window to look out, and I couldn't believe my eyes. I've never seen anything like it. My heart started pounding so hard it felt like my head would explode. The creature was frighteningly large, above 6 feet tall, and looked like a werewolf. I know that's ridiculous, but it was on 2 legs, and it had the head and fur of a dog. It was barrel-chested, extremely muscular, with its front limbs hanging low about to its knees. I shrank back from the window, feeling so scared and sick like I was going to faint. I heard the long claws scrape at my wooden door, scratching and growling, and I slid down the wall, sitting on the floor, praying it couldn't get in. I could hear it moving around the perimeter of the cabin, and a horrible stench like a wet dog began to waft through the cracks in the logs. Suddenly, its head appeared in the window, and I got a good look at the face. It looked like a creature from hell. A dog's muzzle, large fangs like a wolf, glowing red eyes. It was peering in, trying to locate me in the gloomy interior. I stayed still and quiet, frozen with fear, hoping it wasn't smart enough to break the glass. A few minutes passed and it finally moved away. I could hear tearing noises as it found my backpack, and then there was silence. I waited a long time before moving, my legs going numb on the cabin floor. I was afraid to give away my location if it was just faking me out. Even though I was terrified, I made myself sidle over to the window and look out. It was gone. My backpack was in shreds. It was almost evening, and I was too afraid to walk the short distance to where I was parked. I stayed awake all night with the door bolted, afraid to even go out and use the outhouse. As soon as the full light of dawn broke, I made a run for it, getting into my truck and heading back down the mountain, doors locked, stopping for no one. I haven't been back. I can't explain what I saw, but it has ruined my little cabin forever. I might buy a different place if this one sells, but it won't be in Maine. When I was 14 years old, we moved to New Jersey. We found a fairly decent house in the Pemberton area, but it was situated in a pretty rough neighborhood. It wasn't unusual for there to be a lot of shouting and drama from the drugged-out people in the street below. I had pretty much heard it all. Drug dealers, troublemakers, drunken fights, you name it. The house was around 90 years old. It was on a big rectangle of land. The right side of the house was off of a dirt alleyway. It backed up to an undeveloped area of land, and there were tall hedges surrounding the property. We settled in and everything was fine for a while, but there were a few things that made me uncomfortable. There were 4 windows in my room, and only one of them was secured with a proper lock. The rest were the kind of windows that had 2 panes of glass, with an old-style lock that connected the 2 panes in the middle. The lock was so fragile, and sometimes it would just fall off due to how old it was, and there was a tree right outside the window. If I were the type of teenager who wanted to get out at night, that tree would have been convenient. My bed was situated below one of the windows on the east side of my bedroom. Where my head lay was only about 6 inches below the window. I had a view of the old falling-down fence that divided our property from the neighbors. I started to notice strange noises outside my bedroom window about 6 months after we moved in. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I was usually in a state of falling asleep when I heard it. It seemed like a weird rattling sound, like someone breathing really harshly. It was deep and throaty, and the sound creeped in through the crack between the 2 window panes. It didn't happen every night, but I'd hear it a couple times a week. I didn't take a lot of notice of it. I kind of thought I was dreaming since it always happened when I was in bed. My parents went out one night with my brother. I wanted to stay home because I wasn't feeling great. I just laid around watching movies and eventually went to take a shower. I figured I'd feel better afterward. I washed up and then stepped out and grabbed a towel and wrapped it around me. I opened the bathroom cabinet, and when it swung open, I looked in the mirror and saw something weird about the reflection. I wiped the steam off the mirror. I had a good view of the window on the wall to the left of the cabinet. I couldn't quite tell what it was, but it looked like a bizarre face. The window was open a crack to let the steam out. I jumped back and stared at the window. The face was gone. I looked out the window and all I saw was the tree branch brushing against the window. I went into my room and was just puttering around, and then I started blow-drying my hair. I was standing in front of the mirror hanging on my door, and I started to feel weird, like something was looking at me. I started getting goosebumps all over, and I turned around and looked at the window above my bed. I saw a demonic-looking face staring in at me. I don't know how to describe it, but something like a skeletal-looking horse's face with creepy red eyes. It seemed like there was a long tongue sticking out of the mouth. It was just staring at me. It didn't seem to flinch at all when I looked at it. I screamed and threw myself in the floor. There was a strong sulfur smell coming in through the window. My heart was racing. I tried to calm myself down, but I was so freaked out. This bizarre creature had been watching me blow dry my hair. I was convinced that was the thing I had heard breathing outside my window and visiting me probably for months now. I managed to pull myself together and crawl to the door and open it with my fingertips so that I could get out of my room and run down the hallway. I ran into my parents' room and slammed the door shut. I curled up in their bed in a fetal position and wished they would come home. Then I heard a knocking at the window. It was like the thing was tormenting me, trying to scare me senseless. I just laid there clutching my knees and crying. It was out there in the tree, and I didn't know what it was capable of. The curtains in their room were open. I looked over at the window, and I swear I saw this freakish creature unfurl its wings and fly off. I realized I should call my parents, and I ran out to find my phone. Then I heard the front door open, and they came in the house. I was never so happy in my life. I ran downstairs, and my mom ran over to me and asked me what was wrong. I could barely explain what I saw. She made my dad call the police. When they came, they asked me so many questions. But I know my answers sounded crazy. The report was filed, and they looked around the house and found these strange tracks under the tree. They definitely were not human. There wasn't much else they could do. But they said they'd have extra patrols in the area and said I should call them directly if I saw it again, which wasn't very comforting. But my dad did get stronger locks and security cameras. I can't imagine what the hell it was. I live in New Orleans, and as you might know, the place is full of ghost stories. We got the voodoo queen Marie Laveau, ghost tours, haunted cemeteries, all of it. But you kind of get used to it, really. I never really took it seriously and felt that most of it's for show, for the tourists. I figured as a local I was above all that. I knew what to believe and what not to. Not like the rubes walking around with a hurricane drink in a to-go cup, gawking at cemeteries. That was before I turned 18, graduated from high school, and got my own apartment in the French Quarter. I work in a museum in the quarter, so I wanted to live there to be close to my job, but I wasn't sure I'd be able to afford it. The quarter is loud, but it has a certain charm, and if you work in the area, it's much easier to get to your job when you don't have to commute. I figured it was worth a try, though, and I got online to look. When I saw the rent on this apartment on Decatur, I thought maybe it was a typo because it was so low. I figured I had nothing to lose, so I called. The landlord seemed weirdly happy that I'd called, so I thought the place must be a total dump. I agreed to meet him at the apartment the next day, though. He also seemed insistent that we do it before it got dark. He kept reminding me not to be late. So after work the next day, I walked over there. Decatur is a street full of tourist shops and restaurants, and bars. The apartment was above a bar. I don't want to say the name, but it's kind of a local hangout. The type of place that serves free gumbo to get people to buy more beer and has bathrooms with graffiti on the walls. You had to walk up some stairs in the back of the bar to get up to it. Once you were up there, though, it was nice. Tall ceilings, wood floors, just one bedroom and one bath. An older stove in the kitchen, but that was fine. I didn't cook much. The back window looked out onto a nice courtyard with a plant and a little fountain. I liked it and gave him a verbal commitment, but the landlord couldn't take my deposit check quick enough. I wondered if he had a gambling problem or something because he seemed to need that money pretty bad. I moved in a few days later and everything was fine. It's an old building, like a lot of them in the quarter, so the pipes kind of groaned and I couldn't use too many appliances at once or the fuse would trip, but that was okay. That first night, though, I had a weird urge to buy vodka. I don't drink vodka. The corner store called my name. I didn't want to because that stuff's not cheap, but I also wanted to. Had to, really. When I got home, I was going to put it in the cabinet, but something told me to put it in the freezer. Something like almost a voice. Almost, but not enough to scare me. Not yet. Over the next few days, I started noticing an extra glass in the sink in the morning. I don't always do my dishes after dinner, and a lot of times I have friends come over to eat or just for a drink after work. So I wasn't really sure. Did we use 4 glasses last night or 3? After a week, I decided I'd make sure the sink was empty before I went to bed, just to see. Sure enough, in the morning there was a glass in the sink. I'd forgotten about the vodka. I finally put the two together and checked the bottle. It was half empty. I started to freak out. Who was breaking in at night and drinking my vodka? Why? I made sure all the doors and windows were locked, but it still happened. Someone must have a key, I figured. I listened but didn't hear anything. Yet the glass kept appearing and the vodka level got lower. I finally set up a camera pointed at the fridge. It would have to pick up whoever was coming in. By this point, I was terrified, and my hands were shaking the next morning when I checked the footage. It showed nothing, but the glass was still there. I watched it over and over, but I didn't see anything. Finally, I turned the volume up as high as it would go, and I heard something like a voice on the video, but I couldn't understand what it was saying. I thought about calling the landlord, but I didn't want anyone thinking I was crazy. I decided to go to the bar downstairs instead. Bartenders have heard it all, right? I ordered a beer and asked the bartender what he knew about the apartment upstairs. He said he's only been working at the bar for a year, so he doesn't know the whole story, but he heard a guy was found dead up there after Hurricane Katrina. Since then, no one has rented the place for more than a couple of months, he said. Most people just break their lease, leave the deposit, and move out. I asked him what he could tell me about the guy, and he said supposedly he used to drink in this bar. Vodka? I asked. He said, "Yeah, how'd you know?" I said, "Lucky guess." He said some people say someone murdered the guy and others say he just drank himself to death. At that point, I figured I could either move out or see what happened. I mean, there's ghosts in New Orleans, I guess. This one seemed pretty harmless, so I decided to just live with it. So far, so good. This is actually my grandpa's story. He's been gone a long time now, but he always used to tell us the same story as kids. I remember it vividly because he'd tell it so often. No matter what time of year, whether it was around the Christmas dinner table or having a backyard camp out, he always brought up this story. I think it really actually kind of scared him. Have you ever watched Late Night Animal Planet? That's when all the really weird shows come on, about alien abductions and wolfmen and all of that made-up stuff. Grandpa didn't think it was made up. If we were watching Animal Planet and 9 p.m. rolled around, he always made us shut it off. I think it's because it reminded him of what he thought he saw. I always told him that he should really write into those shows and tell his story. He said he didn't want to. He said he knew that those stories were fake because the ghost hunters never actually ever found a ghost. He said that he knew that his story was real and he didn't want to get lumped in with all those pretenders. So, here's the story. My grandpa was a logger up in the Pacific Northwest. He was actually right around Olympic National Park, which is way out on the Olympic Peninsula. It's extremely rugged terrain but full of excellent timber. He worked for a relatively small logging company at the time, but they had managed to sign a lease with the Forest Service to cut lumber from the region. It was really, really hard work. They didn't have chainsaws or great machinery back in those days. They relied mostly on their own strength and teams of horses to get the massive trees they felled out of the woods and to the nearest railroad station. From there, the logs would get transported to a mill, sawn into planks and shipped off to be turned into houses or whatever. My grandpa said that they always set up a pretty big camp. They had a team of several dozen guys, and they all slept in tents and had big fires at night. It was the only way to try and stay warm and dry in that rainy climate. The camp is important because it's really where all the action takes place. My grandpa said that they had just moved spots and set up a new camp. He said that this camp was pretty deep in the forest, but they chose it because of how close it was to a river. They planned to float the timber down the river rather than haul it out with horses. He said they were all pretty excited about this fact. They were in good spirits because it would mean a little less work for them. He said they got pretty loud as they started clearing trees that first day at the new camp, singing songs and laughing. He also said they made a huge bonfire out of debris and all got pretty drunk that night and went to sleep. He said he woke up abruptly in the middle of the night. He actually said that every man in camp did because something huge was moving through the tents and making a whole lot of noise. He could hear footsteps, huge sounding footsteps, crunching the twigs and pine cones with every step. He said the sound that it made was absolutely indescribable, like a really deep grunting and heavy breathing, like how you'd sound after you'd been sprinting as fast as possible up 5 flights of stairs. He said that every few moments, this heavy breathing would get broken up by a long, hollow bellow sound that would climax in a series of ringing hoots. He said it was absolutely ear-splitting. He himself didn't carry a weapon when he was out logging because it was just another heavy item to lug from camp to camp. One of the members of his team did, though, and he always said that he was thankful for that. One of the other loggers had a hunting rifle. Every so often, he'd head off and try to take down one of the Roosevelt elk in the region. The hunting rifle went off after my grandpa woke up, presumably aimed at whatever was in their camp. My grandpa said that the creature went berserk after that and tried to destroy their camp. It knocked over several supply tents and even ripped apart one of the carts they'd used to haul their gear in. The destruction was evident in the morning light. He didn't ever really know why the creature left, but it left without hurting anyone. Maybe it was all just intended to be a warning. He hypothesized that maybe they had gone too deep into the forest in search of good lumber or a good location. He thought that maybe they'd disturbed the creature's home by cutting down the trees. He also wondered if maybe their partying and drinking that night had attracted it to them. Maybe they would have been safe if they had all just quietly gone to bed. My grandpa remained a logger for a decade after that, but he said that was the only encounter he ever had with whatever that thing was. He said that he was always on the lookout for it. It makes sense to me that he could never stand me watching the TV shows about strange encounters. He'd had one of his own, and probably didn't want to relive it like that. He liked telling the story, but maybe that's just because he was able to control what happened in it. As a Yellowstone National Park ranger, I was often out on routine hikes as part of my job duties. These hikes were meant to help me familiarize myself with the park's trails and to keep an eye out for any potential hazards or issues that might need to be addressed. It was also an opportunity for me to observe and interact with the park's wildlife, as well as to educate visitors about the importance of preserving and protecting the natural environment. On this particular day, I was out on a routine hike because it was part of my regular patrol schedule. I was walking along a narrow trail that led through a dense forest when I heard a rustling in the underbrush. I stopped in my tracks and listened carefully, trying to determine what was causing the noise. It sounded like it was getting closer, so I slowly reached for my bear spray, just in case. Suddenly, a massive creature burst out of the trees and onto the trail in front of me. It was a wolf, but unlike any wolf I had ever seen before. The wolf was standing on two legs like a human and towering over me. It had dark brown fur that shone in the sunlight, and its eyes were piercing and intelligent. Its jaws were strong and powerful, filled with sharp teeth. Its claws were extended, ready to attack, and it seemed to be sizing me up as if it was trying to decide whether or not to attack. Overall, the wolf had an intimidating and aggressive presence, and I could tell that it was a formidable predator. I froze, unsure of what to do. The wolf seemed to be sizing me up. Its eyes narrowed and its lips pulled back in a snarl. It was clearly agitated, and I could see that it was ready to attack. I slowly backed away, trying to keep my distance from the wolf, but it was no use. The wolf was too fast. It lunged at me, its sharp teeth and its claws extended. I tried to fend it off with my bear spray, but the wolf was too strong. It knocked me to the ground and began to bite and claw at me, determined to bring me down. I fought for my life, trying to escape from the wolf's grasp. But it was no use. The wolf was too powerful. I was certain that it was going to kill me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Just when I thought it was all over, the wolf suddenly stopped attacking. It looked at me with its piercing gaze, then turned and ran off into the forest, disappearing into the trees. I lay there on the ground, battered and bruised, but somehow alive. It was a miracle that I had survived the encounter with that aggressive, intimidating wolf, and I knew that I would never forget it. I was eventually rescued by a team of rangers and rushed to the hospital, where I was treated for my injuries. The bite marks were deep and numerous, and it was clear that I had been attacked by a large predatory animal. But when I tried to tell the authorities about the strange bipedal wolf that had attacked me, they dismissed my claims and insisted that it must have been a gray wolf. They even went so far as to cover up the incident, pretending that it had never happened. I knew that what I had seen was real, and that the authorities were just trying to protect the reputation of the park. But I also knew that I couldn't prove it, and that I would have to live with the memory of that terrifying encounter for the rest of my life. I have thought about that moment many times since that day, and I have a few theories about why the wolf might have stopped attacking me. One possibility is that the wolf simply lost interest in attacking me. It may have been agitated or provoked by something else, and my presence may have simply been a coincidence. Once it had satisfied its aggression, it may have simply lost interest in me and decided to move on. Another possibility is that the wolf was startled by something else. It may have heard or seen something that caused it to become distracted or frightened, and it may have decided to run away rather than continuing to attack me. Ultimately, I will never know for certain why the wolf stopped attacking. It was an extraordinary and unexpected moment, and one that I will always remember. This is an old story, but my family has me tell it almost every year. Some believe me and some don't. There was a period of time back in the late 90s where I was the property manager for a building in downtown Houston. It was one of those places where different businesses or whatever would rent out floors or suites as their headquarters. My job was basically to be on hand to keep tabs on the cleaning staff and generally be the go-between between any of the renters and the owners. The place did really well overall, but they notoriously couldn't keep tenants on the 4th floor. I wish I could say something cooler like it was the 13th floor that was cursed, but this place only had 9 floors, so what can you do? I'm here to tell you what happened, not what fits the stereotype. We were coming into the fall and yet again some jerk had broken their lease on floor 4 and moved out early. They had to be out by the 15th, and it was my job to make sure they adhered to the agreement. Anytime they stayed behind or left things killed our turnover in trying to get a new tenant for the top of the next month. To make things even better, we were just coming out of a spell where one of our cleaning guys would forget to pull the door shut after sneaking a smoke out back. That, plus downtown Houston in the 90s, meant I was forever chasing teenagers out of the place. It was a treat. One night the janitors were done, and I'd made my rounds before locking up for the night. I crossed the parking lot to the far end where my car was and just happened to look up from my keys to see a light on. On the 4th floor, of course. Now, I might have uttered some words it's not very nice to repeat, but after several nights that month running folks out of the place, I was in no mood for this kind of thing, especially as I'd already made my rounds, and this was just dragging me back inside. Regardless, I was going to have to deal with it. So back in I go and take the elevator up. If I was doing my due diligence, I would have gone all the way to the top and worked my way down again to make sure nobody was on the upper floors, but I was in no mood. Besides, the lights were up on 4, so 4 was where I was going. When I got there, everything was bright, but nobody seemed to be around. Now, to set the scene a bit, the renters that left took all the furniture, but the phones and cubicle dividers belonged to the building. As such, there were still some set up here or there, but most were stacked against the walls. The creepy part in hindsight was that all the phones were on the floors, right where they had been set when taken off the desks. You could see the whole layout of their office structure just by where the phones were on the carpets. Anyway, I go from office to office, making as much noise as possible to flush out whoever was monkeying around. Office after office, no dice. Nobody in sight. On other nights, I might have gone through the whole building again, but I refer you to my former statement of being in no mood. After establishing the floor was clear, I just kicked off the lights and made my way back to the elevator. I'd hit the button and stood there, fuming. Then, all in a second, I knew I wasn't alone up there. I turned around and saw a man walk out of the corner office at the far end. He was dressed like something out of a 1950s newspaper movie or Mad Men. Suit, tie, and a fedora. He saunters to the dead center of the room opposite me and turns to stop. That's my cue to start yelling every name in the book at this guy. I start for him in a full-on huff, and he just does this kind of lazy walk towards me. Something about how calm he is only makes me angrier. I've crossed maybe a quarter of the room when something in my lizard brain starts telling me that something isn't right. All the lights have been cut off, but he steps into a beam spilling up from the lights in the parking lot, and that's when it all comes into place. He's got no face. I immediately start walking backwards because there's no way I'm turning back on this, whatever it is. The elevator opened and closed while I was yelling at this guy, and I reached back to hit the button, praying like hell it hasn't gone back down to the lobby. He keeps getting closer, and just when he's about 15 feet from me, every phone in the place starts ringing, even the ones that aren't plugged in. I feel like I'm going to have a heart attack. The doors behind me open, and I just step backwards into the light of the elevator and hit the close doors button. The guy approaching hasn't changed his pace at all, and the doors close just as his nothing face reaches the threshold. I book across the lobby, lock the doors up, and dive into my car. We secured a tenant within the next few days, and they moved in almost entirely by the 25th. I have no idea if they stayed on long term, as I handed in my resignation before the end of the next month. Most people don't believe me, but it happened 2 years ago. I'm a pretty heavy outdoorsman, hunting, fishing, hiking, the whole 9 yards. I even do some real niche activities too, like snake hunting. I haven't met too many other snake hunters. Most people don't even know it's a thing you can do. Where I'm from, you can catch timber rattlesnakes if they are at least 2 feet long. Calling it hunting might be misleading. It's more like a scavenger hunt. I go out with a hollow plastic tube that has a mark at the 2-foot line and a pair of snake tongs. To put it simply, I grab the snake in the tongs, pop it into the tube, and if it's past the 2-foot mark, I get to keep it and make a belt out of it. The best place to find rattlers is in rock piles. Timber rattlesnakes are not as aggressive as their more famous western cousins. They are very shy, so if you want to catch them, you have to be real sneaky and grab them when they are basking in the sun on rock knolls. The trick is to know which rock piles get sun exposure at which points in the day so you can skulk around them and hopefully get lucky. I was stalking all my usual knolls when things started getting weird. This was all on public land, a state forest. I'm not going to say which one because I don't want internet yahoos traipsing around my backyard and getting themselves killed looking for what I encountered. When I got to my first rock pile, everything was silent. No birds, no bugs, no nothing. Then, as if a gun went off to start a race, 3 sizable rattlers came out of the rocks and hauled ass downhill. I had never seen snakes act like that before. They usually bury themselves deeper when threatened, but I didn't think I was loud enough to spook them either way. I picked my way down the trail in the direction the snakes went. I was careful where I stepped because I didn't want to come up on the snakes unprepared. I'm a crazy, not stupid. Well, not that stupid. The trail took me up a ridge and down into an open valley with a creek running along the bottom. The creek was split into a fork by a large rock formation in the center. I stopped in my tracks when I saw at least a dozen rattlesnakes perched on the rocks. It was an absolute gold mine, but I was nervous about how I would approach that many snakes. Like I said, timber rattlers are less aggressive than other species, but that doesn't mean I want to get stuck in the middle of a crowd of them. I waded into the creek and slowly approached the rocks. I was more concerned with being quiet than visible. I'm pretty sure snakes have crap eyesight. At least that's what I've always heard. I wasn't planning on being greedy. I just wanted to grab the nearest snake and maybe snap a picture or two of the snake party for my buddies, but then all the snakes lifted their heads in unison and glared at something behind me. Rattles and hisses were all I could hear. I wanted to look behind me, but I was also afraid of turning my back on a batch of irritated rattlesnakes. The sounds of splashing became close enough that I knew whatever the snakes were hissing at was right behind me. I could feel hot breath on the back of my neck. All the snakes suddenly became quiet. Everything was silent except for the short, snorting breaths of the thing behind me taking in my scent. When I was finally man enough to turn around, I got the shock of my life. I was prepared for a bear or a hog. Both of those would have been scary enough. But what I saw looking back at me was horrifying. Yellow eyes with black pupils looked down on me with curiosity. Its skin was grayish-green and covered in rough scales like an alligator. The snout was lizard-like and filled with pointed teeth. The reptile thing towered over me, easily 8 feet tall. Huge black claws were on the ends of both hands, and they slowly reached for me. I panicked and flung my snake tongs and tube at the reptilian and dove deeper into the creek. I half swam, half ran in the waist-deep water until I got to the bank and sprinted up the ridge to the path. I ran down the path until my legs burned. I was back near the first rock pile where this whole mess started. I hid inside a divot in the rocks that made a crawl-space-sized cave. I could hear the creature sniffing the air. It casually followed my trail. A black-clawed foot stepped into the space in front of my hiding spot. I could barely fit into the space, so I knew the creature didn't have much of a chance to get me. It stood there at the mouth of the opening, sniffing and lapping the air with its tongue. The creature kept me there for hours. I even got a picture of its foot. I started to lose it. All I could think about was the scene from Jurassic Park when the raptors stalked the kids through the park. I wanted to laugh and cry all at once. Eventually, it just walked off. I stayed in the place for hours afterwards until I heard the voice of my partner and oldest son calling my name. They were worried and had come looking for me. I sprinted out of that hole and got them out of the woods as fast as I could. I was not about to risk my family running into that creature. When I got home, I hoped I was just crazy, and I wished I didn't have that picture I took. Then maybe I could tell myself I lost my mind for an afternoon. I can't stop thinking about what else might be out there. I have always been skeptical of people who claim to have seen extraterrestrial things. So when I had this sighting and it made me feel so excited, I felt kind of foolish. I was not expecting it at all. I know there are some people who are looking for these kinds of experiences and actually take steps to search them out. But I think it's more likely to happen when you're totally not thinking about it. I never even mentioned it to my boss or co-workers. I didn't want to be labeled as a kook. The state park I work for is really one of the most beautiful places I have ever been. It has a nice mix of beaches and trails, and you couldn't ask for a better environment to work in. It's the Emerald Bay State Park in Lake Tahoe. I don't even know if I should say the name. I wonder if that makes people flock to the area. This place already does get really crowded. I've been a park ranger for quite a few years, and this is the busiest place I have ever worked. This experience happened in 2019. I spent some summers out here with my family when I was a kid. My dad really liked to rent a boat and hang out on the water all day, so I've loved this place for a long time. We would kind of alternate between here and Lake Havasu for our summer vacations. I never thought I would end up employed here, though. During summer holidays, the place can be a madhouse. I was on duty on the 4th of July that year, and it was a real crazy day with all those people. After my shift, I decided to go up to Inspiration Point to take in the fireworks show. Lake Tahoe puts on one of the best shows in the country, if you ask me. I got myself some snacks and found myself a good spot to relax. I knew all the secret little areas, so I wasn't near any people. The show started off as usual and was fabulous. About halfway into it, I was looking off to the west a bit, and I saw several orange orbs start to float up toward the sky. I remember thinking something like, those must be some of those Chinese lanterns. Then as I was watching them, I thought maybe they were embers from the fireworks or something. But they were incredibly bright, so that didn't really make sense since embers would be fading. They floated up and seemed to form into kind of a W shape. They started to look like they were remote-controlled or something. At first, they had looked like bright orange lights, but once they were up high, they looked brighter and whiter and started moving around. Then they kept going higher and started looking like stars. They obviously weren't embers. But then, sort of out of the middle of that W shape, there was this craft, or whatever you want to call it, that zoomed down lower and flew over my head. It was too fast for my eyes to really catch what shape it was, like as fast as a bullet. It was still pretty high up there, but the lights on it were brighter than anything I've seen. And right after it passed over, there were like little twinkles of light all in the sky right over my head. Like right over my head, not over the lake where the show was happening. The twinkles of light started making these incredible light streaks. I was beside myself. It wasn't like any technology I had seen before. It sounds a little crazy that I had noticed this stuff while that amazing show was going on. Maybe it was because I was used to scanning the sky almost every night. The lights were behaving in a strange fashion. I can't quite explain it, but somehow those twinkles of light suddenly burst into dozens of lights in the sky. All of a sudden, they were moving together like some kind of squadron or something. It made me feel kind of anxious, but for some reason I was also filled with this strange exhilaration. I just sat there in amazement, unable to comprehend what I was seeing, but knowing it wasn't normal. You could see the stars steady behind them as they were moving across. Then, the dozens of lights came together and went into a triangle formation, whereas before, they were just individually flying forward. Once they formed the triangle, I noticed that they were flying left to right, up and down. It was really surreal to have this amazing fireworks show going on, and there I was completely ignoring it and watching this inexplicable sideshow. It wasn't that high in the sky, but not unnaturally low either. But eventually the triangle seemed to just start ascending higher and higher until I couldn't see the lights anymore. I have never seen anything like what I saw that night before. For the next few months I kept watching the sky, trying to notice anything strange. But I never saw anything on that grand of a scale again. I'm sure people must have thought that what I was seeing was part of the show, but it absolutely was not that. I know there's some military activity not too far from here, so I don't know if it could have been connected to some testing or something, but I really don't think so. I'm a retired police officer, and some of the stories I could tell would make everybody respect us, and what we go through daily so much more. It was a truly thankless job. Nobody likes a police officer, but you need one when you need one. I will admit there were bad apples in our department, but most of my fellow officers get into their careers to help people and protect their community. I have had some unbelievable experiences, but I've only had one truly paranormal experience that made me a believer. There are things that can't be explained. There's no such thing as coincidences, and we don't understand everything that's going on in this world. One night, I received a call about an elderly woman hearing someone trying to break into her house through her attic. I put on my lights and siren and headed there as fast as I could. When I got there, she frantically swung open the door and screamed, "Thank God you showed up. Thank God you came." I ran over to her and asked where the burglar was coming from. She showed me the attic door and I crawled up to see what was going on. I searched that entire attic and didn't find anything out of the ordinary. There were boxes piled up and some pieces of furniture, but not a person trying to break into the house. There were no signs of human entry, and the window up there was locked, so I climbed back down the ladder. I told the woman that she should get an exterminator because if she heard something, it was more than likely an animal. There was no way anybody was up there. She insisted that it was a person trying to get in, and even claimed that it was talking to her, saying things like, "I'm going to get you, and let me out." Just to give her some peace of mind, I went up there and looked around for a while. I checked every square inch of that attic and even opened the boxes and looked inside. It is amazing what kind of junk people save. I crawled back down the ladder and assured her that she is perfectly safe and that I didn't find a single living thing up there. She started crying and pleading with her through the night to save her from whatever was trying to get her. I suggested that she stay with a friend or family member and told her I had to respond to another call. That woman kept calling 911 repeatedly that night and continued doing so every day after that. I would go by and check on her once a day, and she would be hysterical every time I saw her telling me of some of the things that the person up there threatened to do to her. The threats she would describe kept getting more and more gruesome, and she didn't seem like the type to use that type of vocabulary, but I kept going up into the attic to appease her and finding absolutely nothing. Weeks passed, and this became a regular part of my job, and it was starting to wear on me. I explained to her that I could be out there helping people that really need it instead of going up in her attic, but she was adamant that something was up there. I'll tell you something though, I never thought she was doing it for attention. I did figure that she was getting older and more senile and was imagining things, but I believed that she was experiencing something awful. I recommended she talk to a psychiatrist and told her to get a paranormal investigator to look at her attic. I didn't believe in any of that stuff then, but I was desperate to help her get some relief, and I was really getting sick of going over there so needlessly. She agreed to do both, and I went to respond to another call. The next time I saw her, she told me that the paranormal investigators told her it was the most amount of activity they had documented in over 5 years. This actually freaked me out, and I went back up into the attic again. I felt something sinister in that attic, but I kept telling myself that it was just my imagination reacting to what she had told me. Loudly enough for the lady to hear, I kept repeating, "If you're not here for her greatest good, leave now and forever, and the power of Christ compels you." Both of these I had heard in movies about exorcisms, and was mainly just doing so she would believe that the spirits were gone. I left after a while, and she thanked me over and over again on my way out. That night she was brutally mutilated and murdered in her sleep. To this day, it's the most horrific crime I've ever witnessed. She was stabbed over 100 times all over her entire body. Her face was unrecognizable, some of her organs were pulled out of her, and many other details I won't share and get nauseous thinking about. Forensics couldn't find a single piece of evidence, and the lady was beloved in the community. We couldn't figure out a single person that would want this done to her, and our community is still devastated by this tragedy. One thing that still actively haunts me is that the attic door was wide open on the night she was murdered. I know I closed it after me when I left that night, and she was too tiny to have opened it by herself. It could just be a coincidence, that's what I've told myself multiple times, but it's the worst thing I've ever seen, and I don't know how any person could have done something like this. I've never talked to anyone who had anything bad to say about her, and there are so many stories of her changing people's lives for the better. The feeling in that attic that night, along with the paranormal investigators' claims, was enough to make me more of a believer. The brutality of the murder and the attic being open made me completely trust the poor lady's story, and I do believe that the paranormal entity that kept threatening her finally followed through with its promises. This one goes way back to 1999 when I first moved to Los Angeles and took a job with the city sewer department. Most people know by now that there have been colonies of homeless people living underground in the sewers of major cities for a long time. This isn't new information or unique to Los Angeles, as sad as it may be. An unfortunate part of working for Public Works in the sewer department, though, is that occasionally we have to run into these parts of the system and flush out these people. For the most part, they aren't hurting anything, but these colonies do tend to develop their own set of laws that can lead to some pretty dire and dangerous situations if they aren't reminded on occasion that people are keeping an eye on them. One way to do this is to break up the colonies now and again by forcing them to relocate. Of course, nobody likes running people out of their homes, no matter how unseemly those homes may be, but there are kids and elderly people down there too, so you have to try to maintain a certain level of civilization, and at the very least, know what's going on. This particular day would be my first time being assigned that task, and also my last. That morning, I was already dreading the task for the simple fact that it did involve stomping around in the sewers and dealing with unpleasant people in unpleasant situations. I was warned the day prior that I'd be traveling down with a coworker named Rodney to learn how to perform the task, though, and Rodney had always seemed like a pretty solid character, so I was a little bit encouraged in that sense. When I reported to work, Rodney was already getting ready to head out. As I walked in, he gave me a once look over and asked me if I was sure I was ready for all this. I told him I was as ready as I'd ever be, and he tossed me a headlamp. He said to me, "You're not going to believe what you see down there, so just be ready for anything." I shrugged it off. I'd grown up in tough neighborhoods and seen just about anything that I was imagining we'd find down there. Drugs and violence, homelessness and broken families. If you could rattle it off as a stereotype of poor upbringing, I had seen or lived it firsthand myself. I wasn't worried. He didn't seem to like that I was so casual about the situation, though. He got a little more stern with me. He said, "I mean what I'm telling you. Once we're down there, I need to know you're going to keep your head on straight." I couldn't help but laugh. He seemed to be making this whole thing a lot more dramatic than it needed to be. "There's a reason they're sending you with me and nobody else," he said. I let my curiosity get the better of me. "What's that?" I asked, half expecting him to rattle off some crap about being former law enforcement or military, whatever his reason was for having such an inflated ego about the whole ordeal. "Because I'm the only one that can deal with those things and not get scared," he said. Now my curiosity was piqued. Things? What the hell did he mean by those things? We were heading down to deal with people as far as I knew. I didn't say another word after that for a while. I just watched Rodney and did everything he did. I have to admit I was a little spooked thinking about what he might mean. After all, we've all heard the urban legends of baby alligators getting flushed down the toilets and rats the size of dogs. I was actually beginning to wonder if I should have brought my gun. We made our way down the manhole and started down one long tunnel. He sort of glanced back over his shoulder and said, "I can smell them." "You smell that?" We were in a sewer, so I was hesitant to take a sniff, but I did anyway out of pure curiosity. The smell reminded me of my little brother's pet turtle tank when we were kids, that musty, mildewy smell of reptiles and stagnant water. I asked Rodney, "The people down here smell like that?" I still wasn't clear on what we were doing. He kind of chuckled and explained to me, "Before we can talk to the people down here, we have to get permission to look for them." Permission? What was he talking about permission? And from whom? "There they are," he said, and I looked down the tunnel. At least a dozen pairs of eyes were reflecting back the light of our headlamps as we got closer. I started trembling and wanted to turn and run back, but I wasn't about to make an embarrassment of myself in front of Rodney. As we got closer to the eyes, I was surprised to find that they all looked very much like people. They weren't attractive people, I'll give you that much. They all had sort of bulging eyes and thin lips. What I could see of ears were all oversized and a bit pointed, but to catch any of them up on the surface, you'd think they were just ugly humans. One of them approached Rodney and they had a sort of hushed conversation. I stood back and waited, not sure what to make of the situation. As I waited, a child emerged from behind the group and approached me. When she got close enough, I could see that her eyes were a funny yellow color and her pupils looked like slits. As unsettling as all of it was, they didn't seem malicious, and as soon as Rodney was finished talking to the guy, we took off down another tunnel to search for the homeless colonies. Later on, I'd ask him, "What was all that about?" He just shrugged. "I don't know where they came from. I just know they're in charge down here. It's best to not ask any more questions." So I didn't. I just turned in my notice the next day and got out of town. I live in Northern Virginia and used to love going out and exploring some of the lesser-known spots in the area. There's a park that almost no one knows about that's a real throwback to pre-Civil War times. There are completely untouched antebellum homesteads. There's a Revolutionary War wagon route and old Civil War trenches and quite a few random graves. I'm fascinated with that era of time, so it was always interesting to look around there. It's all located along a trail behind fancy neighborhoods and golf courses. The trail's over 20 miles long. But I guess most people don't have time for that kind of history. I was there one day and came upon an old brick chimney. There was no sign of the house that used to surround it, just the chimney. It was in a kind of clearing that surprisingly didn't look very overgrown. And there was a little hearth in front of the chimney with a small stone fireplace opening. What struck me was how clean it looked, like someone had swept it recently. I poked around and spotted a little trail at the edge of the clearing. I followed it into the woods about 100 feet and came to where there was about a 3-foot-tall stone wall marking out a rectangular piece of property. On one edge, I found this old stairway leading down to what I assumed was a stone cellar. There was a wooden door down there that was a little propped open. It started to feel a little creepy, but I was so fascinated and couldn't help but go down to take a look. I pulled the door open and turned on my flashlight. There was a wooden table and a couple of chairs. There were wooden shelves against the walls. I saw old glass jars of food on the shelves. Looked like flour and cornmeal and seeds and such. There were a few piles of stuff, old rags and clothes. I started thinking that maybe somebody was squatting there. I shined my flashlight around and saw that the cellar extended far back, and there was a short passage that led to another area. I went through to a small room. It was mostly dirt, more like a hidey hole than anything. There was this black powdery stuff on the floors against the walls. In one spot, there was a little pile that looked like old rotten fruit. I didn't know what to think. I kept wondering if it was a person or an animal who'd been hanging out there. I didn't have much more time to explore that day, so I left and headed home. It was probably about a month later before I was back in that area. I'd had a hard day at work, and it always calmed me down to get out on the trail and let go of some stress. I'd found what looked like an old family graveyard, and I was trying to read the names and dates. Some of the names were so faded, but I got really into trying to figure out some of the family history. It had gotten later than I realized and was starting to rain. I wasn't prepared with a hat or raincoat or anything. But this graveyard was really close to that old chimney I'd found before. I decided to go wait it out in that cellar since I was at least a mile from my car. I was sure it wouldn't rain for long. I found the chimney without any trouble and headed for the cellar. The door was a bit open like before, and I went in and sat in one of the chairs. I always carry a notebook and pen, so I pulled those out and my flashlight and started making some notes. Part of me always thought I'd eventually write a little history book of the area. I was there less than half an hour when I started hearing some rustling noises. I thought maybe there was an animal down the passageway in the little room. It was just soft rustling at first, so I'm thinking maybe some mice or something. But then the rustling got pretty loud, and I thought I heard a weird flapping sound. By then I was freaking out, thinking it was a bat or something. I stuffed my things in my pockets and headed for the door. I was glad it had stopped raining. I made sure to leave the door open and went up the stairs. It was around dusk, but I was curious about who was in there, so I went and sat on the stone wall farthest from the cellar. I hoped whatever it was would come out. I didn't really think it would, but after about 10 minutes, something opened the door further, and I saw this shadowy shape. Okay, I was really freaking out now because it was something big, like 5 or 6 feet tall. Before I had much time to think, it jumped up all the steps at once. It turned its head toward me, but I didn't see any face. But I did see these horrible red eyes that looked like they were glowing and looking right at me. I tried getting to my feet and just tumbled backwards off the wall. I crouched down there looking over, and I kid you not, this thing spread out these huge, black, leathery-looking wings and half jumped and half flew up into the trees. Oh my freaking God. I split out of there, running as fast as possible toward my car. I'm no runner, and by the time I got there, I thought I was going to die. I finally calmed down enough to drive, but all I could think on the way home was how I'd been in the cellar with that thing only like 10 feet away from me. How could something like that be real? I never went back there again. I had this weird encounter back when I was a lot younger and was just a free spirit looking for adventure. I have never been able to find an explanation for it. I figured this was as good a place as any to put it out there. I used to love going out solo camping. This one time I was camped out at Rio Grande Gorge up near Taos, New Mexico. There's no human activity at night, but during the day Manby Hot Springs is pretty busy. I had gone to the springs, and then I had spent the day wandering around on the west rim of the gorge. I had just got back to my campsite, which was close to the Rio Grande River. I got my camping stove lit and boiled some water for my ramen, and was watching the sunset over the rim of the gorge. After eating, I was about to nod off, but I got the feeling I wasn't alone. I figured I was just being paranoid, so I just stayed there half asleep. Being October, it was pretty chilly after the sun went down, so I was bundled up in a down bag and had a hoodie on. I had no tent. I was just cowboy camping. I think I remember feeling a wet nose against my cheek first, before I felt claws on my thighs. 2 badgers had crawled onto my lap and were checking me out. Badgers are fine from a distance, but up close at night, they were terrifying. I screamed and jumped up, and they just looked back at me. The little bastards wouldn't leave, so I started scooping water out of the river and throwing it at them. This made me cold, and I think it amused them more than it scared them away. But they didn't get any closer after that, so I decided I didn't care. Still, I had had a bit of a fright, and my imagination was going a bit crazy, so sleep was not going to happen. They had backed off, so I got back in my bag and leaned against a rock trying to fall asleep. It wasn't really that late, but I was tired from hiking all day and I really didn't want to stay up all night dealing with critters. I was trying to settle myself down when I noticed a faint blue glow coming from somewhere far up the gorge. The blue glow got much brighter over a short span of time and seemed to be accompanied by a low buzzing sound. It was a weird blue. Not white blue like moonlight. Not bright blue like emergency lights. It was kind of like the color when you're underwater in a swimming pool at night. I was pretty interested by this point, and already freaked out by the badgers, but I brushed it off. But the glow seemed to be slowly getting closer and the buzzing was getting louder. The blue never got any brighter, but it seemed to get clearer. It's hard to describe because what happened next dominates my memory of the next several minutes so strongly that I'm not sure what happened right before it came around the bend in the gorge. What I saw was a wall of blue light moving between each of the walls of the gorge, but I couldn't tell if it ended with the river water or extended into the river. The buzzing was definitely coming from the wall of blue light, or slightly above it. I had no clue what was happening, but I had the feeling that I should get out of the gorge before it got much closer. I grabbed my gear and threw everything into my backpack and went along the river until I got to the bridge across the river. I had no car because a friend had driven me up from Albuquerque and dropped me off. I got to the bridge and there was an old man on a horse. He was wearing a black cowboy hat and a poncho. He was just parked there on his horse looking north. Looking at the wall of light, I yelled out, "Hey!" but I got no response from him. At that point, I'm starting to question my sanity or sobriety. I had been drinking a little earlier, but I wasn't usually a lightweight. I started to run along the road to the east, along the river to hopefully get somewhere more normal. The buzzing was getting louder. I looked back and I was only about 20 yards away from the bridge. It had seemed like I'd been going for much longer. The man on horseback finally looked at me. Our eyes met. I felt really freaked out. I felt like I was not supposed to be there. I started walking backward, keeping my eyes on the bridge. The wall of light had kind of gone around the corner where two canyons intersected. I couldn't exactly see it directly anymore. I was fixated on this old man on horseback and trying to fight my urge to turn my back to him and run as fast as I could. I saw him raise a hand and hold his palm out to the light. It stopped immediately. The buzz faded away and a stream of blue light shot up into the sky. I looked back and the old guy had disappeared. I mean, it is possible that he just galloped out of there on his horse and shot up the steep canyon on the other side of the bridge. But that seems unlikely. It was like he just disappeared into thin air. I walked about 5 miles that night and finally hitched a ride back into Taos and checked myself into a motel in the morning. I don't know what the hell I saw that night, but that was incredibly surreal. I'm a student worker at the Ohio State University Main Library, officially known as the William Oxley Thompson Memorial Library. This thing is huge, 11 floors, which are mostly stacks, meaning rows and rows of bookshelves. You can stand on the bottom floor and look up at all those books, which is not good if you have vertigo. I'd been working there for a few months before I noticed anything unusual. I mostly reshelved returned books, so I spent a lot of time walking around in the stacks, pushing a book cart. One day, though, the student who normally helped the librarians close up was sick or something, so I had to stay late. It closes at midnight, and by then hardly anyone's around. A few really dedicated graduate students. There's a ton of lights in the library because, like I said, it's huge. So they start turning them off before closing, and around that time, the workers walk around to make sure no one's still inside before locking the doors. It's a little creepy, to be honest, because during the day, light comes from the big windows and the skylights, but at night, it's a lot darker. As I was walking around, I saw a light at the end of a row of bookshelves. It was bright but flickering like a candle. I'll admit I was scared. I didn't want to confront some weirdo who was lighting candles in the library. When I got closer, though, it flickered again and went out. I reached the spot where I thought it was coming from, and I saw nothing. I figured it was just some weird thing, or maybe I was imagining it. But then, that student, the one who was supposed to close normally, she quit, just up and left OSU. So naturally, I was put on that shift. Now I had to close on every shift I worked, which was 3 days a week. I'd pretty much forgotten about the light, but as soon as I walked up to that same place on the 5th floor and saw it again, I remembered. It disappeared again when I got close. I don't know what was going on, but after that, other weird stuff started happening with the lights. They would follow me, going on as I walked and then off as I passed. One far away would flicker and then go out. Finally, I asked one of the librarians why the other student quit. She said she was scared of something but wouldn't talk about it anymore. I wanted to keep my job, so I didn't push it. I looked up some stuff on ghosts, trying to find out if it was a ghost, how I could make it go away. But all of them said you had to know something about the person, the dead person, before you could really do anything. I started sneaking off to spend part of my shift looking at old copies of the campus newspaper. I'd grab a volume and flip through a few pages whenever I got the chance. It was slow work since I had no idea what I was looking for. But one day, as I flipped through one of the yellowing-bound volumes, I felt something like a flash of lightning in my head. The story in front of me was about a girl who was caught burning candles in the library. This was in the 1970s, before the renovation of the library in 1977 that I'd seen mention of in other issues of the paper. The article noted that she'd been found dead outside the library, and people were speculating that she'd been conducting satanic rituals with the candles. Cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, but no cause was listed. I turned forward through the next few issues, but there weren't any other stories, which told me they never found out how she died. At least that was my guess. So I had some information, but I still didn't know how to get rid of her ghost. If it was her, and if I could do it, both big ifs. I did some more research and people always said ghosts need closure, but there was no way I could figure out who killed her, if someone did, way back in 1973. There was one idea that might work though, I thought, and that was making an altar. Well, not really an altar, like one of those roadside memorials, you know, with pictures and flowers and stuff. So I photocopied the picture of her from the paper and got some fake flowers. There are always bookshelves in big libraries like that aren't full. I found one in the most remote part of the library, the very back in a corner, and put a little memorial there. I even found a little angel statue and stuck it with the other stuff. I don't know if ghosts can sense stuff like that, so I made sure that night when we were shutting down to walk to the memorial. And yeah, the lights were turning on in front of me and off behind me. This time, now that I knew, or at least thought I knew what it was, it seemed less creepy. Almost just like someone walking there, except I couldn't see them. When I got to the memorial, the lights flickered. I walked away without looking back, and the lights stopped following me. After I was pretty far away, I turned and looked back. I saw that bright candle-like light seeming to hover near that shelf where the memorial was. The next night I walked around and didn't see any weird stuff with the lights at all. It was strange, almost sad, like I almost missed it. When I went to where the memorial was, it was gone. Maybe the janitor picked it up, or maybe something else happened to it. I don't know. But I never saw that flickering light again. I lead a scout group in Wisconsin. The scouts have this camp in the Northwoods near a lake. I don't want to say which one cause. This whole thing's a little crazy, as you'll see. Anyway, this particular camp is a good one for beginners because it's not real big. The kids stay in canvas tents with concrete floors, so it's kind of like camping, but not. There are little bathrooms with showers in them and fire pits. I've taken them there before and never had any problems, but this time was different. Started out like usual. Luke and I hauled all the stuff from our cars. Food, fire-starting materials, junk the scouts brought that they wouldn't need. They did their little hike around the grounds, which isn't very big, but it is surrounded by the Northwoods, so there's not much out there. Nothing unusual happened, except I noticed a few dead animals while we were walking around. The kids and Luke didn't notice because they were off the trail. I did because they looked chewed up, like as if something gnawed on them and then moved on, which is odd because most times wild animals eat their prey, they don't just chew on it. But I kind of forgot about that with the usual drama of trying to get a fire started and Luke's dumb idea of trying to make an oven out of soda cans, pie plates, and a copy paper box. He's been watching too much YouTube, I guess. Finally, we sang the usual songs around the campfire and started to get the kids to go in their tents. They're all around 10 years old, so they got a lot of energy until they don't. They were in their tents by 9, probably watching videos on the phones they weren't supposed to have, but I didn't care as long as they were quiet. Luke was in the tent with me, and he was reading with headphones on. I didn't like to do that in case the kids needed something. They were in 2 different tents on either side of ours. I heard the usual forest sounds, bugs and frogs mostly, and sometimes a stick breaking in the woods. Suddenly I had a weird feeling. I felt scared for no reason I could think of. I got my flashlight and went outside. I shined it around, but I didn't see anything. The bathroom had a light on it, but other than that, the camp was dark. I hadn't thought about it much before, but on this particular night, we were the only group there, probably because it was September and starting to get pretty cold at night. Anyway, shining the flashlight around didn't really do much, as you know if you've ever been in the woods at night. I smelled something, though, like if something died and rotted. Must have been a dead raccoon around, I thought, but still, it made me more nervous. I'd never been nervous at this camp before. I went back inside, but I couldn't sleep, partly because the cots had these terrible vinyl mattresses on them. The sleeping bag slid around on it. Plus, it was cold. I started hearing crunching noises like something big walking around in the woods. Could be a deer, I thought, but I still had that bad feeling, so I didn't believe it. I went out there again with the flashlight, and this time, before I shined it around, I thought I saw red eyes looking at me from the edge of the wood. But it was just a second, and I wasn't sure I hadn't just imagined it. I told myself it was nothing and went back inside. I guess I must have slept for a while then, because the next time I woke up, I heard birds chirping. It was dark in the tent, but when I went outside, it was gray, like just before the sun comes up. I looked toward the spot where I'd seen the red eyes, the trees just beyond the fire pit. This time I saw more than just the eyes. I swear what I saw was the Wendigo. It had a skull head with rotten flesh hanging off it. Just looking at it and smelling that horrible death odor made me almost throw up. I was also terrified. I knew I had to get Luke and the kids out of there fast. I always carry a whistle around my neck, and I blew it and yelled, "Everyone up! We're going to breakfast." Luke came out of the tent first. I knew he was going to say that we had breakfast. We'd packed pancake mix and bacon we were going to cook. He saw the look on my face, though, and he knew something wasn't right. He helped me get those kids into the cars, even though they were complaining. Didn't let them change or go to the bathroom. While I drove, I pretended like nothing was wrong. Acted like it was a prank or maybe a drill, like a fire drill. Kids were too tired to complain a lot. In the nearest town, there's a diner, and we stopped there. While the kids lined up to use the bathroom, I got a couple tables. When Luke and I sat down, he said, "What was going on back there?" "Something was out there in the woods," I said. The waitress came over and filled our coffee cups. She must have heard, because she said, "I hear the Wendigo's been around. You camping, you'd better watch yourself." Luke looked at me and asked, "Was that it?" "I think so," I said, but I knew it was. After we ate, we went back and packed up. It was light out by then, but I still watched the woods. I didn't see anything except a chewed-up raccoon that I hid under some leaves before any of the kids saw it. Everyone will say I'm crazy or that my imagination ran away with me. But it was the most chilling thing I've ever seen, and it shook my belief system to the core. I no longer can say what's possible or impossible. Everyone knows Savannah is reported to be one of America's most haunted cities. I visited several times and even stayed in rooms that were supposed to be hotbeds of supernatural activity, but I never saw anything, not even an orb. Savannah's a great place to visit anyway, so I stopped ghost hunting and booked a weekend trip with my sister just to relax. We weren't planning to do anything spooky. I don't know if you or anyone hearing this is familiar with Factor's Walk in Savannah. Factor's Walk is a multi-level brick and cobblestone area dividing 2 streets along the Savannah River. It kind of looks like a back alley behind the waterfront restaurants, but it's a very interesting historical area. Reportedly, there are tunnel systems running all under Savannah for a whole host of reasons. The tunnels that are now sealed over at Factor's Walk were used mostly for transporting slaves unloaded from the ships in secret, away from prying eyes. There are also tunnels under certain restaurants that claim they were used by nefarious sea captains to Shanghai unsuspecting tavern patrons, forcing them into service at sea. So, the Factor's Walk area, like most of Savannah, is supposed to be haunted. But I'm done with ghost chasing, so after my sister and I had purchased refreshments from a local cafe, I decided to sit and people watch on a nearby bench while she investigated the Klusky Vaults. The Klusky Vaults were built in 1840 and are open to the public to explore. Some people speculate there once were passageways that connected the Klusky Vaults to the rest of the tunnel network. Today, the vaults look like underground storage units, just big, dark rooms built with brick and stone, set in the side of an embankment. My sister walked inside the first one, and I let my gaze wander, thinking about where we should eat dinner. After a few minutes, I looked up and didn't see her. You can't see all the way inside the vaults from where I was sitting, so I wasn't concerned. Until a few minutes later when she hadn't reappeared. I watched for a few minutes more, staring at the 4 different entrances, unsure if she'd emerged and popped into a different vault to explore. I started to become concerned and stood up, intending to find her. I took a few steps forward and called her name. Suddenly she appeared, standing in the doorway of the same vault I'd seen her enter. I walked in her direction. She was staring at me with a bright smile on her face, but her face looked weird, shiny, almost like plastic. I was about 25 feet away at the time. She didn't look quite like herself, but it was hard to say what was off. Maybe her eyes, sharp and glittering. They looked a little unmatched, like maybe they were set at slightly different heights from each other. Her grin looked lopsided and fake, and stuck in the same expression. There was something not quite right about her. And she didn't speak, just stared at me with that weird, unchanging grin. "Lynn," I walked closer, frowning. "Are you okay?" I had gotten about 15 feet away when she abruptly turned and walked back into the vault. I thought maybe it was some kind of joke, like she knew I wasn't into the spooky stuff anymore, and she was planning on popping out and scaring me when I followed her inside. You know, just for laughs. So I stopped right where I was and called her name. "Lynn." I know I sounded impatient. Then I heard it. My sister's voice calling to me, not from inside the vault, but from behind me. I whirled around, and there was Lynn frowning as she walked toward me. "What's going on?" she asked. She still had the coffee cup from Cafe M in her hand. I stared at her, totally uncomprehending. "Where were you?" I asked. The hairs on my arms started to rise, and I felt goosebumps. She pointed to the row of vaults to our right. "I checked all of them out. I just came out of the last one, and you were standing here calling my name. What's going on?" My knees felt weak. What had I seen? It looked like Lynn. No, correction. It looked like something that was trying to look like Lynn, but not quite succeeding. I must have gone pale because Lynn grabbed my arm and steered me back over to the bench. I kept my eyes fixed on that first vault while I told her what had happened, but nothing ever emerged. She told me then that the first vault had felt really uncomfortable to her, and she'd spent less than a minute inside. It felt so claustrophobic and depressing. There was this sense of a dark energy in there with me. We both just stared at that first vault, wondering what it had been. What sort of creature could take on the appearance of my sister and step forth into the sunlight? Had it tried to lure me in there? For what purpose? I shivered. "Do you want to go look in there?" Lynn asked me. She sounded scared too. I shook my head. Most definitely not. Whatever was in there, trying to escape from that vault on Factor's Walk, was not something I ever wished to encounter again. I live in Pocahontas County, West Virginia, which is God's country, you know. But what I seen the other day wasn't a creature of God's making. I know a bunch of people say the end of days is near, but I never pay attention to that kind of talk. But now I'm not so sure. I work at a gas station on a pretty deserted stretch of road, just farms all around as far as the eye can see. It gets pretty boring, and most of the time me and the owner, Billy, just hang around and talking. I got to wonder how that man keeps his bills paid, because I tell you what, that station isn't bringing in much cash. But his business is his business, so I'm not asking any questions. Just glad to have a job right now anyway. A lot of my friends still aren't working. It was a Wednesday, and we were hanging out in the chairs he's got sitting up by the side of the building. There had only been 4 customers all day, and Billy was rambling on with some fishing story he'd told me a million times. But I was bored as heck, so what was I going to do? I was pretty much tuning him out anyway, just nodding my head and saying, uh-huh. We heard a shotgun fire real close by. That's not that unusual, but then it went twice more, and Billy looks at me and says that Fox is probably in Garner's chicken coop again. Then all of a sudden, we saw it. There was this giant bird-like creature flying straight over the treetops, heading in our direction. I say bird-like, because it wasn't no bird. It looked like a small dragon, even though that sounds like one of Billy's tall tales. I couldn't see it that good, but good enough to know it wasn't one of God's creatures. Billy says, well, I'm not going to say what he said, but he was surprised as heck, just like me. And then we saw it land over in the trees right across the road. I couldn't believe my eyes, so I asked Billy, did that look like a dragon to you? And he said, not a dragon, but a gargoyle. Well, I've never seen a gargoyle, so I don't know if that's right or not. But he says, it's one of Satan's creatures for sure. I'm going to get my gun. Now, don't be calling me a chicken, but I gotta say, I wasn't liking the idea one bit of us going there across the street where the thing landed. I mean, it looked big. As big as a yearling calf, at least. And if it had come from hell, who knows what demonic powers it would have. I had my doubts Billy's gun would do much good against it. I'm sitting there wondering how I could get out of going over there with him when we heard a truck come roaring up the road. From the direction it was coming from, and the bad muffler, I could tell it was Jerry Garner's old pickup. Yep, Jerry screeches into the parking lot a second later, hopping out looking mean as hell. He's got his rifle in his hand. Billy asked him, that creature come from your place? The one with the wings? And Jerry says, yeah, it was in my barn when I went in there to get a feed sack. It was hanging from the rafters upside down. I said, like a vampire. And he shook his head and said, this isn't a vampire. It's one of Satan's minions. Billy says it landed in the trees over yonder. Let me go get my gun and we'll blast it back to hell. Jerry nods and tells us he already winged it, but I don't know about that since the thing was flying just fine. Billy came out with his gun and he and Jerry started off. I just said, hey, I'll stay here in case we get a customer. They didn't answer, and I felt kind of ashamed because we all knew I was just saying that because I was scared. They crossed the road and I watched them until they went into the trees. Then I couldn't see them anymore. I prayed for them, though, standing there in the parking lot. I asked God to watch over them. A shotgun blast, then another, and all of a sudden I see that thing fly up out of the trees. I don't think they hit it. It started heading right for the gas station. I asked the Lord please protect me, because I surely thought that creature was making a beeline for me. It flew right over my head and kept on going. I could see these giant leathery wings and a small head shaped like a horse's head. It had a tail like a dragon, though. Too high up for me to see its face or say what color it was. But I sure was glad it kept on going. Billy and Jerry came running back across the road, yelling they hit it and looking in the sky. But it was gone. I don't think they hit it at all. I told them the direction it went, and they were quiet for a minute. No telling where it was, I guess, so how could you follow it? Billy went in the store and grabbed a couple of brews, and we all sat down then. Jerry said he was going to tell our preacher about it, and Billy and I just nodded. That was probably a good idea. It's just my opinion, but I don't think a man or even 10 men could bring down a creature from Satan. I think God and his angels will have to take care of it. It was Christmas Eve, and I was running late to dinner at my parents' house. It was my first year working in retail over the holidays, and everyone and their extended families were out buying last-minute gifts. I didn't expect my shift to run that far over. No rest for the wicked, I guess. My family usually just gets cheap Chinese takeout for Christmas Eve. Not very exciting, I know, but I was looking forward to it regardless. I had planned to have at least an hour to go home, take a shower, and make myself presentable, but it looked like I would have to leave right from work if I wanted to make it to the party at all. It has begun snowing during the last hour of my shift. Not enough to stick to the roads, but enough to make things pretty slippery. Great, I thought. Just what I need. As if I wasn't already late. The drive to my parents would take about 40 minutes, but it would likely be an hour with the snow. I closed the store with another coworker and got in my car. The snow was falling in big flakes now. The parking lot was a little slippery driving, but the streets had been salted. Maybe I wouldn't be as late as I had thought. I soon left the brightly lit city streets and headed towards the dark country roads. My parents didn't live in the middle of nowhere or anything, but I had to drive through a couple of towns to get there, mostly on state highways surrounded by farmland. The snow was falling heavily by now, and visibility was not great. I remember snow sticking to my windshield wipers and freezing, so much so that I had to pull over and try to clean them off. I wasn't quite sure where I was. The visibility was so bad. It looked like I was near the game farm, but I couldn't tell for certain. The game farm is a big waterfowl area, super swampy and marshy. In the winter, it just looks like a normal field except for the barren swamp trees scattered throughout. I squinted through the snow to see if I could make out if those were the swamp trees or not. If they were, then I was only about 10 miles away from my parents' house. As I was looking out at the trees, I thought I saw lights glowing from the other side of the road. They were small, sort of a reddish yellow, just the two lights. I held my hand up to block the snow and see if I could get a better look. By this point, I had recognized the game farm, but I couldn't see what the lights were on. There was no way a person could be walking around out there. This was our first big snowfall of the season, and it hadn't been cold enough for the ground to freeze. Anybody out there would have fallen right into the swamp. The lights looked like they were moving closer to the road, but with the snow, I can't really say for sure. But that's what they looked like. I stood outside my car and watched them, trying to figure out what they could be. They went out once and came back a second later, then twice. Then 3 times, and I realized they were eyes. The lights going out, whatever it was blinking. I jumped back in my car and locked the door. I watched it for a moment. I knew I should drive away, but I desperately wanted to see what it was. The eyes stopped moving towards me, but they stayed fixated on my car. I drove away, and whatever it was didn't try to follow me. I had all but forgotten how late I was to Christmas Eve dinner. The only thing I saw was its eyes. I didn't even see a shape or an outline of its body. I can say that it looked to be around my height, about 5.5 feet tall. The snow was still falling steadily, and while I was driving slowly, I was confident I left the creature with the glowing eyes far behind me. But I didn't even make it half a mile before something ran in front of my car. I didn't hit the brakes because I didn't want to slide off the road. It looked big, maybe a deer. I don't think I hit it, but I saw something moving in the ditch on the other side of the road. I pulled over, but I didn't want to get out of the car after the incident at the game farm. So I just watched in my side mirror to see if the thing in the ditch moved. It was hard to see through the snow, but it looked like the creature was getting up. It stood up on 2 legs, and for a split second I thought I had just almost hit a person on the road. But then I saw its eyes. The same reddish-yellow eyes from the swamp. There must be 2 of them because there is no way that one could have gotten here so fast. I was driving slowly, but I was still going at least 45 miles per hour. But as it stood up and shook off the snow, I realized how it could have gotten here so fast. And how it ran right in front of my car without getting hit. It had wings, like birds' wings. I don't know. It was hard to see in the snow, but it for sure had wings. It was too dark to see its face, but I saw its eyes and its wings. I drove dangerously fast the rest of the way to my parents' house. I'm surprised I even made it, and thankfully the creature didn't follow me again. I don't have any other explanation for it, and I haven't ever seen it again since that night on Christmas Eve. At the time of this encounter, I was a park ranger at a state park in Arkansas. The place was just gorgeous. Arkansas is known as the natural state since there's so much scenic beauty there. One of the main attractions are the waterfalls. Arkansas has about 300, and some of the best ones tend to be in more remote and mountainous areas. Part of my job was to maintain the access points to these falls in order to minimize risks for people coming to visit them. A lot of my days started really early. I would get on the trails first thing in the morning to check if there were any hindrances. Things happen like flooded creeks, quick mud, dangerous wildlife, etc. The rainy season is approximately October, May. The best time to see the waterfalls is in the rainy season since a lot of the falls go down to a trickle in the summer. So I was out there in a lot of wet weather. The job isn't for everyone. It involved a lot of isolation and rugged terrain. I was pretty much always wearing my steel-toed wading boots and carrying climbing tools and ropes and stuff. I enjoyed the isolation, though. I've always been an introvert and never was hesitant to get out there alone. One morning I was headed to a pretty remote area that had been impacted by flooding and long-time water erosion. I needed to assess the damage. It had been closed to the public and we wanted to make it accessible again. I got up before sunrise and drove out. When I got there, the road went from gravel to dirt, which is common in backwoods Arkansas. Eventually, the road became no longer recognizable because of some past mudslides and rock slides. I had to park my truck and head into the blocked area on foot. There was quite a bit of destruction on the old road, and I had to bushwhack my way through a lot of spots. I eventually came upon the creek, so I knew I was on the right path. I hadn't ever actually been to this waterfall before, and I was relying on GPS, so I was glad to see the creek. I had to wade through the flooded creek for a couple of miles or so. I was really surprised when I suddenly came across an old, abandoned-looking vehicle next to the creek. It didn't have any license plates on it. The car was pretty beaten up. As I got closer, I saw a lot of scratches on the metal and a smashed window on one side. The window that was shattered had some type of cloth on it, and there were dark splotches all over the interior. I didn't really want to know what those were from. Maybe fungus or blood. Next to the car looked like someone had made a campsite of some sort. There were some old cans and what looked like remnants of a campfire. There were large rocks around it resembling seats. I noticed that the rocks had a layer of dirt on top of them that had formed a topsoil of sorts. That meant that the rocks had not been sat on in a long time. I wasn't even sure how long the road to this place had been closed. As far as I knew, it had never been open since I'd been hired for that area. It seemed that whatever had happened there had been quite a while ago. But that still doesn't ease your mind when you're in a pretty remote area all alone. No matter how much you don't mind isolation. I kept going with my bushwhack machete unsheathed and my flare gun at hand. At that point, I was out of the creek and back up on the dirt road. I hadn't gone much further when I was assaulted by this horrendous smell like blood and rotten meat. It was what I imagined a slaughterhouse would smell like. It just came out of nowhere. I started to feel a creepy presence and I slowed my walking way down and started scanning the landscape. When I looked out past the creek, I saw a gigantic animal. It was crouched over a big deer carcass. My first thought was that it was a gargantuan wolf. But I know there aren't any wolves in Arkansas, and this thing was bigger than any wolf could be. It looked like a werewolf. It was bent over the carcass, eating. It had very long legs with very little fur on them. There was a huge mane around its neck, and the tail was really puffy. The head was unnaturally large, and the forearms were incredibly muscular. Seriously, if you try to bring up an image of a werewolf, that's the closest I can describe it. By some miracle, it didn't seem to know I was there. I held my breath and backed away so slowly I felt like I was barely moving. It took about 5,000 years before I felt I was far enough away to turn around and make the long trek back to my truck. The whole way I was gripped by a fear more intense than I had ever felt. I had all these wild thoughts going through my mind. Like, was that thing connected to the owner of that car? I didn't even want to imagine what might have happened. I notified the authorities about my finding of the car and sighting of the creature. I'm really not sure what measures they took to track it down. But that trail continues to be marked as off-limits to this day as far as I know. I've told a few people about what I saw, but honestly, what are they supposed to think? None of them has ever come across such a thing.